into some pretty heavy stuff today. We're going to be talking about sudden infant death syndrome, SIDs, and child abuse. You've shared some medical research on this, and it seems like you really want to understand it better. And that's great. Whether you're a parent or caregiver or, just someone who cares about kids, understanding this stuff is so important. And it's not about scaring anyone. It's about, being empowered, having knowledge.
Yeah, I totally agree. As a forensic pathologist, my job is to look at these tough situations objectively and, try to piece together what happened. And let me tell you, it's rarely simple.
Right, of course. So let's start with SIDs. Now, I think most people have heard the term, but just so we're all on the same page, can you explain what SIDs actually is?
Absolutely. So, SIDS is when a baby, a seemingly healthy baby, dies suddenly and unexpectedly, and they're under a year old. And and here's the truly heartbreaking part. Even after a thorough investigation, even after an autopsy, we don't know exactly why it happened. That's why it's often called a diagnosis of exclusion. We only get there after ruling everything else out.
So it really is a mystery, even for medical experts like you.
Yeah, in many ways it is. We have theories, of course, like some researchers think it might be problems with the part of the brain that controls breathing and sleep. Others have looked into potential metabolic disorders or issues with, the heart's electrical system. But even with decades of research, there's no single answer, no one cause we can point to.
You mentioned the brain's role in breathing and sleep, and it makes me think about all the advice parents get about safe sleep practices for infants. Is there a connection there?
Yeah, you're right to make that connection. One of the biggest things we've learned about SIAs is it's not just about what we don't know, but also what we can do to reduce the risk. It might surprise you, but something as simple as putting a baby to sleep on its back has drastically reduced SIDS deaths since the 1990s.
Oh, wow. Seriously. Just changing a baby's sleeping position has made that much of a difference.
It really has. Back in 1992, doctors were recommending side or stomach sleeping, and the rate of SIDs in the U.S. was 1.2 deaths for every 1,000 live births. But by 1996, after the Back to Sleep campaign promoted, back sleeping, that rate dropped to 0.74. So yeah, we're talking about almost cutting the number of deaths in half.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It really shows that even small changes, when they're based on good research, can have a huge impact. But it sounds like even with all this progress, SIDs is still a heartbreaking reality for some families.
It is. It is. And that really emphasizes the need for sensitivity, for compassion from, medical professionals. When we're dealing with SIDs cases, we're not just dealing with, medical mysteries. We're dealing with families who are experiencing just unimaginable grief. They need support and understanding just as much as they need answers, especially when those answers are so hard to come by.
That's so true.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even with all our medical advancements, sometimes we just don't have all the answers. So we've talked about what SIDs is, the heartbreak it brings to families. Before we move on, is there anything else about SIDS itself that we should, make sure we understand?
Yeah, one key thing is that SIDs is most common in infants between 2 and 4 months old. And then there's a sharp decline after 6 months.
So it's really about those first few months.
Yeah, and that's important because it helps us, focus our prevention efforts and understand the age range where vigilance is most important.
Right, so being extra cautious during those early, more vulnerable months.
Exactly. Knowing this information can really empower parents and caregivers to be extra cautious, extra informed during that critical period.
Okay, so we've established that SIDs is this complex, often baffling phenomenon. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another crucial aspect of child safety, recognizing the signs of abuse. This is where things get even more difficult, I think. But we have to talk about child abuse because, like you were saying, even small changes can make a huge difference in protecting kids. And I guess knowing what to look for is a big part of that.
It really is. And I think, a lot of people have this picture in their mind of what child abuse looks like, the, battered baby kind of thing. But it's so much more than that.
You're saying it's not always obvious?
Right, exactly. Child abuse, it can be physical, but it can also be neglect, even psychological harm. It could be a single awful event, or it could be more like a pattern of behavior that just really wears a child down over time. And I think maybe the hardest part to accept is that it's not always, a stranger or someone we think of as dangerous. It can be a parent, a partner, someone in the family, even another child in the home. And, we have to be able to admit that if we're going to actually protect kids.
It's tough to think about that for sure. But you're right. We can't just rely on those stereotypes. So what are some of the warning signs, the things that might mean someone is hurting a child,
Yeah.
even if it's not immediately obvious?
Well, we can start with the physical signs, I guess, since those are often what people think of first. Bruising, for instance, that's really common in child abuse cases. But it's not just about whether there are bruises, it's about the kind of bruising.
What do you mean? Like, what should we be looking for?
Well, the location is important. Bruises on the face, the neck, the chest, abdomen, behind the ears, those are always concerning in young children, especially babies who aren't moving around a lot yet. And the pattern of the bruising, that can tell us a lot too.
Like those clustered bruises that kind of look like fingerprints?
Yes, exactly. Fingertip bruises or any bruise that looks like it came from grabbing or pinching, those are definitely red flags. The size and shape matter too. Like a larger bruise, one that's kind of irregular in shape, that could be from a slap, maybe a punch, but smaller circular bruises, those might be from someone gripping too hard.
So it's like you're, looking for clues at a crime scene. Every little detail could be a piece of the puzzle.
That's a good way to put it. And speaking of clues, skeletal injuries, those are another big warning sign. Fractures in infants, those are always worrisome, especially if there are multiple fractures or things like spiral fractures.
Spiral fractures, those are the ones that
Yeah.
like twist around the bone, right?
Right. Those are very hard to get accidentally, especially in babies and toddlers who aren't, super mobile yet. Same with fractures of the skull, ribs, long bones. Those should always be looked at really carefully. And I mean, this might seem obvious, but anytime a kid's explanation for an injury doesn't really match up with the injury itself, that's when we have to really pay attention.
So we've got bruises, fractures.
Yeah.
What about internal injuries? Those seem like they'd be even harder to spot.
Yeah, you're right. Internal injuries are tough to diagnose because a lot of times there aren't any external signs. A kid might say their stomach hurts or be throwing up, but you might not see any bruising. And the scary thing is, those internal injuries can be really serious, even fatal in some cases.
Hmm.
We're talking about damage to the liver, the spleen, tears in the intestines.
And you mentioned something earlier, I think, called a duodenal injury. What exactly is that?
So the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, right where it connects to the stomach. It's really vulnerable to getting injured from like a blow to the abdomen. And sadly, it's a pretty common injury in child abuse cases.
Because like a punch or a kick to the stomach could damage that area without leaving a mark on the outside.
Exactly. And those injuries can be life-threatening if they aren't caught and treated quickly.
Wow. It's amazing how much there is to know, even about something like bruising. It really makes you appreciate the expertise it takes to spot these signs.
It's true. And it shows how important it is to get medical help anytime you even suspect abuse, even if you aren't totally sure. Better safe than sorry.
100%. Now, we talked a lot about physical signs of abuse, but you said before that it's not always that clear-cut. What about those other forms of abuse, like neglect or psychological harm?
Right, those are just as serious. Neglect, it's often more about a pattern of behavior than any one event. It might be that a caregiver consistently fails to provide food, clothing, shelter, medical care. Or it could be that they're exposing the child to dangerous environments or situations.
So it's not just about what someone's doing to a child, but what they're not doing as
Right.
well. What about psychological abuse? How does that usually show itself?
Psychological abuse can be even harder to see because it leaves these invisible scars.
It's like it's designed to be hidden, almost, which makes it even, I don't know, more sinister in a way. How does that kind of abuse usually, how does it show up?
It can be so many things. Maybe they're always putting the child down, humiliating them, threatening them, or they might be isolating them from other kids or even exposing them to like domestic violence at home. And the damage it does, it's real, it lasts, it affects their self-esteem, how they form relationships, just their whole sense of self, really.
It's awful to think about the impact that kind of abuse can have, even if you can't see it, on the outside.
Exactly. And that's why we have to remember child abuse, it's not just about, physical injuries. It's about the whole pattern of behavior, whatever harms the child, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological.
It's really striking to me just how much nuance there is to all of this. It makes you realize how important your job is as a forensic pathologist.
It's definitely challenging, yeah. But somebody's got to do it. And it's especially crucial when we're talking about like the overlap between SIDs and child abuse.
Right, we haven't even gotten to that yet. You mentioned before that sometimes what looks like SIDs might actually be, intentional harm. Tough subject, but obviously we can't shy away from it.
Of course not. And that's really where forensic pathology is so essential. We're trained to look for these really subtle clues that might, distinguish a tragic accident from something, well, something intentional, for example, smothering, that can be really hard to prove, but there are often these tiny little indicators we look for.
So in cases where there's even a suspicion of that, you're brought in to figure out what really happened.
Exactly. And a lot of times it starts with a really, really thorough autopsy. We go way beyond the standard procedures. We do a detailed exam of the entire body, including something called a subcutaneous dissection.
Subcutaneous dissection. What is that exactly?
So basically, it means we're looking under the skin, looking for any signs of bleeding or injury that you wouldn't be able to see just from the surface. We also take samples like blood, urine, tissue, and we use things like x-rays to see if there are any fractures or internal injuries that weren't obvious at first.
Wow. It's like you're putting together this giant puzzle, looking for all the missing pieces. But in these cases, those pieces could be the difference between, a tragic mystery and actually getting justice for a child.
That's exactly it, yeah. And it's not just about finding the physical evidence, but it's also about, like, analyzing it objectively. We have to
Hmm.
think about all the possibilities, accidental, intentional, and figure out if the injuries we see match up with a fall, maybe a medical procedure, or if they point to something more like, inflicted trauma.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance, but it's so important.
I bet that takes an incredible amount of expertise to be able to tell the difference between those things.
Yeah.
And then, on top of that, you have to be sensitive to what the family's going through too, right? It must be so hard to be looking for the truth, but also offer compassion to people who just lost a child.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most challenging parts of the job, for sure. We never, ever forget that behind every single case is a family that's hurting. And even if what we find points to abuse, our job is to stay objective, present the facts, and then the legal system, they take it from there.
You mentioned earlier that since that Back to Sleep campaign has been so successful in preventing SIDS deaths, there's been more focus on these other possibilities, like smothering. Is that something you see a lot?
It's something we always have to consider, definitely, especially when a case at first glance seems like it could be SIDs. The tough thing with smothering is that it often doesn't leave any visible marks on the body. The amount of force it takes to suffocate a baby, it's terribly small. So we might not see any bruising or any obvious trauma at all.
So how do you even begin to figure out if that's a possibility in those cases where there's nothing obvious to see?
It's a lot of careful thinking, careful investigation. We look at the scene, the circumstances around the baby's death, their medical history, and of course the autopsy. If there's anything that seems off, any red flags that don't make sense, then we have to look closer.
You also mentioned something earlier called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and that sounded particularly disturbing.
It is. It's a very complex and disturbing form of abuse.
Hmm.
Basically, it's when someone caring for a child, usually the mother, makes up or even causes symptoms in the child to get attention.
You mean like they might exaggerate symptoms or even like actually make the child sick?
Sadly, yes. They might mess with medical tests, even directly hurt the child to make it seem like they're sick. In the context of SIDs, it's horrifying to think about, but it's something we have to be aware of.
It's just heartbreaking to think about a parent doing that, but like you said, we can't ignore these things.
We can't. And it really shows how important it is to have everyone involved, everyone working together. Doctors, social workers, law enforcement. We all need to share information and be really watchful to make sure kids are safe.
This has been, wow, incredibly heavy, but so, so informative. Thank you so much for shedding light on these issues and for the work you do, seeking justice for those who can't speak for themselves.
Thanks for having me. It's important to talk about this, even when it's hard.
It really is. And to everyone listening out there, if you're feeling overwhelmed or if this has brought up any concerns for you, remember that you're not alone. There are resources available. There are organizations dedicated to SIDS and child abuse research prevention support. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you need help. Because even one child protected, one life saved, makes all the difference in the world.